everyone! In today's video we are going to be showing you a Lilo and Stitch design that is extreme 3D. So I did an extreme 3D Grinch and Max design back in December and it turned out so well and I loved it so much and I made little stand-up characters, so I decided to do it again. This time it's with Lilo and Stitch surfing and there's this huge wave coming up near the back of the nail by the cuticle and it's just so bright and tropical, and there's Lilo and Stitch with Lilo's hair blowing behind her and Stitch's ears blowing behind him, and it just has so much movement even though it's still and stationary, and it's so cool. I hope you guys love it as much as I do, and I will see you next time. Bye!
So we're going to start out by creating that gradient in the background, that kind of oceanic, it's not really a gradient I guess, but it kind of goes from one thing to the next. So start out with your sand at the tip of the nail, and then at the cuticle area, the proximal fold, you're going to add a dark blue, blend it into a lighter blue. You kind of want to build these colors up, and then I'm going to add a little bit of a teal. So now that we have that started, we're going to keep kind of adding those colors, and you're going to go back and forth from like the blues to the teals, adding in some white, marbling them together. You want it to be darker at the cuticle area and then progressively fade and blend over into that sand. Now add a layer of clear acrylic, and for me, I actually made that a little bit too, it cured too fast. It was too dry of a bead. So I ended up with this really sharp white line, which you'll see later, which isn't exactly the plan. Much better to do it all very wet. See, that one turned out so much nicer for my little wave, but it's fine. It's yeah, it's just one of those things that, you know, you kind of see and you learn. So we're going to add those little bits of the white of the wave, and then after that's done, we're going to file this nail into shape with our e-file, making sure that it stays nice and smooth and not to overdo it where you file away any of that detail that you're adding in. And so then after you have that done, and now we're going to start sculpting our little characters on a nail form backing. So if you don't know what a nail form backing is, because I do get that question periodically, so if you sculpt a nail, which is when you're building up a nail enhancement and you don't use a tip, you put a sticker form underneath the fingernail and you build it up, there's this sticker backing that you can save and you can use for sculpting things on top of it, which I always save all of mine, and sometimes I end up with this huge pile, and you can't use them, repeatedly over and over again as far as like hundreds of times, but you can use them. I probably use mine 4 times, I would say, on average, every once in a while, depending on what it is. If you're doing something with like black or red and it's really dark, only once. But if you have a color, like sculpting these little characters, they don't really add any residue or staining on the nail form backing, so then you can save them and just keep using them. But otherwise, they just create this really nice, smooth base for sculpting things. You can also use something like labels from shipping labels. If you get that kind of a sticker backing, that works too, but it seems like those are thinner, and so they stain and they get kind of wrinkly and discolored a lot easier. So I like to save the nail form backing ones. So anyways, after that little impromptu nail form backing explanation, you're going to sculpt Lilo's arms, legs, head, and body. And you're going to sculpt them separately besides the head and body. Those can be attached. Once they're done being sculpted on the nail form backing and they're cured and they're hard, you can hold them with the tweezers and you can start building up more depth to these characters just by holding them. So you want to make them look 360 degrees like they're actual little people, they're little sculptures, or well, little people and little aliens. So we're going to start out by rounding out her head, sculpting in a nose. And then after you have that done, you're going to try to, turn it around. You don't want to squish her head too much, so you don't want to overdo that when you try to do her body. So you might want to just set her to the side for a little bit and then go back and start adding some more depth to her body as well. When you're adding depth to her body, you got to think of the position that she would be standing in. I'm doing a voiceover with my cockatiel and she wanted to get her word in. You want to think about the position that her body's in. So she's going to kind of be sitting with like her chest forward, her butt sticking out a little bit, her knees bent. So when you're sculpting her body, you have to have all of that kind of running through your head as far as how to sculpt her body. So you just have to kind of balance it out. And what you have to remember is that when you sculpt it initially flat, you're taking a slice out of the middle. So you have to build acrylic out to the, to the front and to the back. And then that's where you can build in that sort of position that she's standing in. So now with yellow acrylic, we're going to be sculpting in her swimsuit. Try to keep this layer really thin so it doesn't look super bulky. If your acrylic isn't pigmented enough to sculpt a thin layer and have enough color pay off with yellow, you may want to paint that in instead with either acrylic paint or a gel paint or gel polish. If you do use acrylic paint, you have to be careful when you go to when you go to add on her arms and her legs, because the monomer from your acrylic will kind of dissolve the acrylic paint. So you either have to top coat it or seal it or protect it some way. Then we're going to glue on her legs. Again, remember the position she's in. Her legs should be bent and they should be positioned just so that it looks like she's kind of got that stance. You don't want her to look off balanced. So then after we have the legs on, you're going to build them up with a little bit more acrylic, making sure that they look like legs. So just, again, with this, anytime I sculpt a character like this, make sure that the whole time you're sculpting, you're looking at it from the left, from the right, from all angles, just to verify that your character looks complete from all angles. You don't want it to look, flat in one spot, or like if you look at it from behind, there's just weirdness. You want to just keep monitoring it from all directions to make sure that everything looks good. So now after you have those legs finished, then you get to add on Lilo's arms. And when you add on her arms, she's going to have them out to the sides. So you gotta, again, think about how she would be when she was surfing. Her arms are gonna be balanced. So you're gonna dip. One thing I like to do is I put a little drip of nail glue onto my nail form backing, that same nail form backing I was using before, and I'll dip the pieces into it so I get just the tiniest amount of nail glue on them so that it doesn't take quite so long to dry. And I would definitely recommend employing the use of 1 to 2 tweezers during the creation of any little tiny character like this. It'll just help the process along so much better than having your fingers in the way, especially if you, like me, wear gloves while you're working with acrylic. Then it just seems to cause trouble to have that glove material getting in the way, and you just easier to use tweezers. I especially like those little offset ones that I was just using. So now that you have Lilo done, you can set her to the side and we can start sculpting our stitch on a nail form backing. It can probably be the same one that you're using before. And we're going to start out with the same kind of thin shapes, just trying to get a slice of his body. His legs can actually be sculpted on and attached at this point. I wouldn't do his arms. You want to kind of have free range of where they're going to be positioned. So we're going to sculpt those to the side, but you can do his head, his body, and his legs. If you want to, you could also add his ears at this point. Again, not attached to the side, but that would be up to you. So now we're going to be filling him out, bulking him up, making him look like he's a 3D character from all sides, just like we did for Lilo. Again, I'm going to start on his head, adding some bulk to the front and to the back of it, really trying to fill it out and smooth it out. Look at it from the sides, especially. Sometimes when you're building something up on a flat piece like this, you add a nice roundness to the front and a nice roundness to the back. But then if you look at it from the side, you can see this little seam. So I like to go through and make sure that seam is covered so that it doesn't have that little line. Kind of reminds me of something that's made out of plastic where you can tell where things were attached together. Same kind of an idea. After you have his body nice and bulked up, you can add his arms, add some more depth to the arms. The great thing with Stitch is he's a little bit quicker to make than Lilo. So if you start with making Lilo and you get kind of an idea of how it goes with her, then you can know that Stitch is easier. Or that's usually my take, is I try to start with the one that I perceive as the most difficult and then do the easier one second. Otherwise, if you want to kind of get your sea legs, if you will, for sculpting these little 3D characters, you could start with Stitch and then do Lilo. Back to your nail form backing with kind of a tan color acrylic, or you could really do whatever color you want for their surfboard. You're going to sculpt a surfboard, try to pat it out fairly thin. Not too much detail goes into a surfboard. So if your brain is all tired out from sculpting those first 2 characters, you get a little bit of a rest. And then to make the little wave, you're going to take whatever color you liked the best. I would recommend like a shimmery teal or a light blue color from your ocean. And you're going to sculpt kind of just a rough like half circle. Doesn't have to be anything perfect. When it's started to turn matte and you can pick it up, you're going to pick it up and press down the flat side onto the nail and then ruffle up the top of it. Don't make it a nice smooth line. You want to give it just a little bit of like a wave. I mean, it's a wave, so that makes sense. But you want to kind of give it a nice little curved wave in the middle. Smooth it out so it transitions smoothly from nail to the wave. Blend everything out, kind of hold it up if you want to, and just keep fixing it and adjusting it until it's really holding its shape. Once you have the front of it done, then you can go through and fill in the back of it too to make it kind of go where it blends into that darker edge on the back of the nail. I grabbed a little bit of that darker blue that I used and I swirled it into my teal. And for this whole thing, I'm using, little bits of clear with it too, so it has a little bit more clarity and really gives you that ocean water feel. So it's not quite so opaque and solid looking. And then I'm going to add just a little bit more to the inside. Keep looking at it. For this part, I would recommend looking up some images of actual waves. You can look up and see exactly how they look and kind of get some ideas for the shape and the color. Add the little bit of the water breaking at the top of the edge of the wave with some light acrylic, pulling that down both the front and the back, blending it out. It doesn't have to be a smooth, perfect line. It can be a little bit uneven. You can have some fun with it. It doesn't, like I said, no perfection needed. I'm going to add some 3D waves. That wasn't necessarily part of the plan in the beginning, but like I said, I had that one wave that looked like a too crisp line. Anytime something like that happens in your art, remember that you can just cover it up, which is what I just did, which is a beautiful thing. And I actually used that wet acrylic from it to seal down my surfboard. I'm going to further attach the surfboard with a little bit of clear acrylic underneath it to keep it nice and strong so it's not going to fall off because there really wasn't too much holding it on. And then once that's done, thank you for the advice, Cookie. Cookie's my cookie tail, my cockatiel. We're going to be attaching our Lilo and our stitch. So as you're putting them on, keep in mind, make sure that you put Lilo close enough to the front so that there's plenty of room for stitch, but also keep in mind how far they are from that wave. You don't want to accidentally run out of room for, say, Lilo's hair or Stitch's ears. You want to make sure that you leave plenty of space for all of that and enough room just to have it, look comfortable and not like it's too close. After you have that done, I did not sculpt their feet before, so I just did the ends of their legs, their ankles, no toes. So you're going to have to go through and add the feet. I actually think you're better off to do it that way because the feet will act as like a grounding base for the 3D piece, and it'll add some strength to where that nail glue is because, again, like I said, I've said in so many different videos and this one too, you don't want to just do nail glue. A little bit of nail glue is kind of the key, and then acrylic to secure things together because you don't just trust nail glue. I did sculpt Stitch's ears separately. I forgot to videotape those. I do apologize, but then we're going to be attaching those to Stitch's ears, or his ears to his head, with that touch nail glue. And then after that nail glue is on there, then you're going to want to go through and secure it with some more of your blue acrylic. That shade of blue is so pretty. It's one from Koopa. One thing I do want to say though, if anybody is looking at Koopa's acrylic line, I recommend their 3D monomer all the time. I absolutely love it. I think it's amazing. If you're sculpting extreme 3D characters like this, it is incredibly helpful. But to use it with a different brand of polymer, because their triptych powders, which is what that blue one is, it's a triptych powder, it's a dipping powder, an acrylic powder, a 3D powder. It's not meant for making 3D things that build up this far because it isn't very stiff. It stays slightly flexible. So I don't recommend using it in a case like this. It was just the perfect color, so I had to use it anyway. And it just stays a little bit stretchy almost. And I've used it a few different times and I've mentioned this, but if you're looking at getting a powder like this one, you might want to go with a different polymer monomer combination just because of how that one works out. It's actually really nice if you're sculpting things that are 3D that aren't built up off the nail where you're worried about that flexibility problem. So like 3D flowers that are just flat on the nail, it sculpts beautifully for that. But for something like this, it's just not really the way to go. With a lighter shade of blue, I added the patch of light blue on Stitch's belly and then the patches of light blue around his eyes on his face. And then you're also going to need to do different things like the darker blue on his nose and then the darker blue patches on his back, toenails, ears. There's just all these little details on Stitch. Those things that I'm doing now that I am telling you to do with acrylic, you could certainly do with, you could do that with paint instead if you wanted to. So it is kind of nice to have a little bit of that 3D built up, especially for, say, nose and toenails. But those patches on the eyes and around the belly, if you are happier to paint, if that's something that, just works better for you and you have more colors and more options in it, then there's no reason to not use paint instead. And so we're going to add little toenails. And the only reason I did the patches on the back with acrylic instead of trying to do it with paint, because in that particular circumstance, paint probably would have been easier, is I just wanted to make sure that the color matched his nose and his toenails. So I did go through and do those patches on his head and his back with that same color of acrylic. And it is a little bit awkward to do that with the wave in the way. And if you wanted to do those before you attached him down, you could have. And add his little tail. I'm going to build up his nose just a little bit more. It didn't have quite enough height for my preferences. And then just a little bit of a darker blue tip on each ear. Now going back to our nail form backing, we're going to be sculpting little sections for Lilo's hair. So just kind of make, not really teardrop shapes, but just sort of kind of petal shapes. They don't have to be anything too perfect, but with black acrylic, just make a couple of these different shapes, do a few at a time. And then as they're starting to turn matte, pick them up and place them on her head. So they will still be slightly sticky when they're in that particular phase where they're just starting to turn matte. And so they will stick down to her head. You will want to secure them, like I say with everything, with more acrylic, but it just gives you that nice kind of control of getting that 3D hair look where it'll flow off the nail. It is a bit tedious. You do have to do multiple sections of hair like this to kind of give it that piecey look like hair does when it's blowing in the wind. But really the results are so worthwhile, I think. So place down that next piece. And then as you're placing all of these pieces, you'll kind of find out which shapes you need, which pieces you need more of, because eventually, like you saw, that one was way smaller just to kind of tuck underneath around her neckline. So those pieces might not be as big. So you just have to kind of keep filling them in. And then as you're going through, adding more and more, you don't really have to fill in the center of her head. You just have to make sure that all along her hairline, it kind of looks full and completed. And so as you keep adding these pieces, you may find that the actual hairline needs to have a little bit of touch-up done because it'll look a little bit like it does right now, a little bit piecey. So if you need to fill that in with black, that's perfectly fine. You can kind of adjust her hairline there with a little bit more control than just doing those separate little pieces if you just go back through with some black acrylic. And plus that will really help seal down all of those loose separate pieces that were sculpted on. And you can really figure out her specific hairline, which is a little bit, it's got like a kind of a widow's peak to it almost. And as you're adding all of those little bits, the one last thing you want to do for Lilo's hair is to give her kind of a swoop of hair that's shorter in the front, that's kind of sticking almost straight up. But fill in all of those other gaps before you worry about that. Just keep adding the black acrylic. And if your black acrylic doesn't work very well, because sometimes black acrylics are a little tedious, I would recommend possibly, depending on how pigmented it is, sometimes it's nice if you mix in just a little bit of clear acrylic to it. It gives it a little bit more workability. It will dilute the pigment, but sometimes it's the fact that the acrylic has too much pigment in it that causes the problem. And so if you have one that just seems like it doesn't work, try mixing in just a little bit. Like, don't overdo it. Make sure that it's a tiny amount of clear acrylic. And then when you are using your black, to use it a little bit more wet. Add Lilo's ears. You want to do that after you do her hair so you don't accidentally stain them black. So make sure you get her little ears in there. We don't want to forget those. And then after you have that done, then we can start doing all of the final details with acrylic paint, which really is one of my favorite parts because you have all of this beautiful work that you've done. You know, it's probably been 2, 3, 4 hours that you've been working on this piece so far. I mean, it's a time-consuming deal to make these little characters. Extremely rewarding, but time-consuming. And then you just have a couple minutes left to add these few final details and everything comes to life. And I would definitely recommend using acrylic paint for these instead of using a gel paint. If you want to know more details on kind of my thoughts on when to use acrylic paint and when to use gel paint, I do have an online class, one of my live classes that I did from a few months ago that is all about gel paint and acrylic paint, when to use which one, which way, you know, in which circumstances one works better than the other. And I can put a link to that video in the description box below. But this is definitely an acrylic paint moment. So we're going to use some red for stripes on Lilo's swimsuit. Going to go through and add some brown outlines around, you know, the neckline of her swimsuit, her toes, her fingers, any place like that. A little bit in her ears maybe. Just basically anywhere we want an outline that isn't super sharp. Her facial features like her eyes and her eyebrows, you are going to want to do black, but then, and her mouth, but other places you don't have to have them be that harsh. Add a little bit of color in her mouth. She's got a nice big open smile. She is happy to be surfing. On Stitch, you're going to go through and do his final details as well, making sure you add things like his eyes, his smile, little outlines. Same thing, you're going to want to do those with a darker shade of blue and not do all of the outlines with just straight up black. I didn't have quite the right shade of blue, so I actually mixed my darker shade of blue on my thumb with a little bit of blue and black together, just to kind of get it to be that right shade really quickly. It doesn't take too much to just mix those colors. Add a little bit of pink in his ears and in his mouth for his smile and his tongue. And then after you have all of these characters done, then you get to start doing some top coating. And like I said, doing the acrylic paint is one of the most fun parts. So is the top coat. When you add top coat to a design like this, you really know you're close to the finish line. You know, you've worked so hard. And if you guys actually make a design like this, please send me a recreation because it is so amazing to look at these. I mean, I know what goes into making them. And just to see how much effort you guys would put into recreating one of my designs is a very humbling experience. So if you do decide to make a recreation, please share it with me. Once we have all of our details done, all of our painting done, apply some really glossy, high sheen gel sealer over the water. You want to make sure that looks nice and shiny and wet. Once that's been cured, the two other kinds of top coat I'm going to be using is called a 3D Glaze, which is a semi-sheen. It's just like basically regular lacquer top coat, no curing required. Doing that over the surfboard, and then matte top coat over Lilo and Stitch. So we have 3 different shine levels to this. And then once that is all done, you can see how it turns out. It is so adorable. I love it so much. I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making these characters. I plan on making more extreme 3D characters like this where they're standing up in the future. I made my first ones with, it was the Grinch and Max for Christmas, and I got addicted and I immediately had to make Lilo and Stitch too. I have some more coming up in the coming weeks, so come back for those and I will see you next time. Bye!